Hello and welcome to part 2 of the Valentine's Day Q&A featuring the Love Doctor. That would be me answering your questions pertaining to love and all other subjects as well. Justin Fisher asks, what's the worst book you've ever read and what's the worst book you've ever written? Well, as far as the worst book I've ever read, hard because there are a lot of really bad books. And if I start a book and it's clearly going to be really bad, then reading is a big time investment. So unless I'm getting some kind of enjoyment out of it, unless I'm just really having a grand old time with how bad it is, and I'm able to watch it to read it in that same kind of way that you watch a terrible movie and laugh at it. But it's hard to do that with a book because a book is, for one thing, it's something you read on your own, so it's not like you can make wisecracks with your friends like in Mystery Science Theater 3000 with a movie. And for another thing, a book is much more of a time investment. So that's why I have a hard time answering that. There are so many terrible books out there. I will say that just so that I can give some answer to this, that as a boy, as a lad, I loved the Hardy Boys, and I returned to it at some point in my adult life. I went back and tried to read it again, and it was so flat. It was so formulaic. It really, but as a kid, I just lapped it up. I mean, I think there must be something when you're young enough, you just, if something is in your wheelhouse, if it's like, yeah, they're private investigators solving mysteries, that's so exciting. Or if you're watching a TV show, like I watched a lot of bad sci-fi TV shows, and just loved them as a kid. I loved this Japanese show called Space Giants, which was awful. And I watched shows like Buck Rogers with Gil Gerard, which was, I think, objective. I still have affection for it, but I can't say that it's any good. I mean, I try to watch it now, and I'm distracted by how bad it is. But at the time, it was just like, oh, this is cool, yeah, and it didn't bother me. I didn't, whatever the flaws were. I think there's a part of when you're in your childhood, there's a time when you're able to just lap things up, and in some ways, it's better, even though you're less discerning. You enjoy things more. They have to be things that appeal to you. But the Hardy Boys would be an example of, if you look at Hardy Boys books, they're all supposedly written by a man named Franklin W. Dixon. And I only found out at some point, really later on in the game, that Franklin W. Dixon never existed. And just like there was the Nancy Drew author was named Carolyn Keene, and there was no Carolyn Keene either. What they did was they just it was a franchise, and they just hired authors to write these books in a certain style, and they were just anonymous. And I guess they got paid whatever they got paid to write those books. But okay, and as far as the worst book I've ever written, I can't really go there. They're all my children. It's like asking who's my least favorite child. I would say that my very first book, considering suicide, is the book that has it has certain passages in it that are that have been changed around, where the wording has been shifted, and things were phrased differently just because the editor Chip Smith, who I liked, who I got along with, who was cool with me and everything. But he just, that was just his thing. At least it was his thing with me, where he thought he liked my book, but he thought it needed to be strengthened in certain places, and so he had certain ideas for how this should be rewritten, or how that should be rewritten. And at the time, I had never published any book before, so I just sort of thought, oh well, this is the way it goes. You have an editor who looks at your text and maybe makes suggestions for changes here and there. And I wanted my book to be published more than anything else. I just wanted to see it get published. It took forever to get it published too, because Chip's company, Nine Banded Books, was a very small company. It was just basically him, and he just put things out, at a very leisurely pace, and it kept getting kicked back. It was a few months longer, a few months longer, and a few months longer. And I just wanted to see it get published. So he would make these suggestions for changes, and I agreed to, I would say, most of them. Now, there weren't that many of them, but there were a handful of times where he said, well, here's my idea for this passage. What if it reads like this instead of what you wrote? And I would say, sure. But there were a couple times where I put my foot down and said, no, Chip, I really would like to keep it the way I wrote it. And he said, okay. And so eventually, it got published, and I was finally a published author. So it's not my least favorite book, but that's the one book I would say, especially the second part of the book, the nonfiction part of the book, I think was a little more, Chip was more eager to try to beef up in certain ways, and, and I just didn't know any differently. Everything I published after that, no other editor ever did anything like that. They looked for typos or grammatical errors, or improper punctuation, technical things, but not to try to change the way that sentences were phrased and so forth. So that's not my worst book, but it's the one that I would say is the least me, just because of the changes that were made to it, that I kind of felt pressure to go along with, just because I wanted to get the thing out, and I didn't want to be a stick in the mud or a pain in the ass about it. He probably did improve upon my writing in some places, because Chip's a good writer too. And it wasn't that he thought he was a better writer than me. He just sort of thought, well, it needs a little hamburger helper. That's the way he put it once. And I didn't know that just wasn't, I thought that was just what editors did. But if you get into writing, that's not what editors do. At least not in my experience, except for this one experience. Okay, in these Goings Down asks, have you read any H.P. Lovecraft or Thomas Ligotti stories? If so, were there any you liked? I got around the late aughts, I for some reason got into an H.P. Lovecraft mode, where I just decided I'm going to read a ton of H.P. Lovecraft. And it was like I read a whole bunch of his stories, in a block. In a blocked period of time, I read only Lovecraft. And imagine what my mindset was. Imagine what that does to a man's mind when the only reading that he consumes is H.P. Lovecraft. I mean, you really need to have something to leaven that. And I just had gotten into this mode where I'm going to check him out. I'm going to see what H.P. Lovecraft is all about. He's a fascinating writer. Reminded me a lot of Edgar Allan Poe. I don't think there would have been a Lovecraft if there hadn't been a Poe first. I think Lovecraft, without any evidence, because I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that he must have been heavily influenced by Poe, just because there is such a similarity in their styles and in their subject matter. So I liked everything I read. I think it was obviously gloomy and horrifying and very eldritch, right? He's the only author ever to use the word eldritch, seemingly. Like he invented the word, but he didn't invent the word. The word was around. He just seems to have been the only writer to take that word and use it, and he used it a lot. So, and Thomas Ligotti stories. I read one book of his. I can't remember the title of it. I remember Chip Smith also was into him. Maybe he had even published something by him. And I think it was Thomas Ligotti who kind of got paid off, kind of got ripped off by the makers of True Detective, season 1 of True Detective, because the character that's played by Matthew McConaughey is like this nihilist who just thinks that life is more trouble than it's worth. So he's like an anti-natalist, and that we should resist our programming to have to want to reproduce, and just this very gloomy outlook. And it was, I believe, taken from Thomas Ligotti, but I think they only paid him a pittance and didn't really give him much credit. So I don't remember any titles, though. I don't remember the title of that one. I don't remember. It was too long ago with Lovecraft for me to remember specific titles or titles of things that I liked. All his titles were great, like the Mountains of Madness. They're all very evocative and pulpy. All right, Dunzo Donald asks, what's the value of chivalry in 2023? Is there a romantic story you would tell? Well, the value of chivalry. I don't think of chivalry. I'm a little different from, I think, some of the MGTOW folk out there. I don't think of chivalry as like, being simpy. I think of chivalry as being manly. And yes, it's you're courteous with women, but it's not out of some kind of deference to them as better, higher, more exalted creatures than yourself. It's just like, if you're riding the bus and an older woman gets on, or a younger woman gets on. Of course, if it's a younger woman, then your motivations might be muddled. It might be like, I'm doing this to impress her so that she'll like me. But in any case, I don't have a problem with a guy getting up and saying and giving his seat to a woman. And for some MGTOW guys, that's just like, well, why should I have to do that? It's like the feminists want to be like men, so let them stand. And I understand the I get how it's like, this is the world you wanted, so we're going to give it to you. But I just, for one thing, I don't feel that put out by standing. It's one thing. It's one thing if it's the end of the movie Titanic, and Rose, there's plenty of room on the little plank for both Rose and Jack, but Rose just takes it all to herself and lets Jack freeze in the in the cold Atlantic Ocean. Um, that's 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 ridiculous. Um, but just like you want to. I see nothing wrong with if you're with a woman and I don't know, you do things to be protective of them. When I was married, I kind of had that instinct with my daughter. I still have that instinct. Um, I don't see that as demeaning or simpish or cuckish or anything like that. I think there's a way to do it, and that's very dignified. So I'm pro chivalry. Is there a romantic story I would tell? Yeah, I've tried to tell a couple of romantic stories already, uh, but I don't know if I can answer any more explicitly than that. You can look at some of my fiction. There's a bit of romance there, a bit. Justin Fisher asks, why do you think Eastern Orthodoxy has become popular among dissident rightists as opposed to traditional Catholicism? It's really strange you would ask that question when just a couple days ago I discussed a story about the FBI, some whistleblower leaking this document from the FBI saying, we know that all these white nationalist types are becoming traditionalists, are becoming what they call RTC, radical traditionalist Catholics. They're finding in these radical traditionalist Catholics, these rad-trad Catholic church bodies. They're finding a home there. So it seems like the FBI thinks otherwise. But I do know that plenty of dissident right people are into Eastern Orthodoxy too. Um, I don't know. You see, it's hard for me to say because I don't have a large enough sampling. Uh, and I don't haven't put out a survey or anything. It seems like I'm still tempted to think that most dissident right people Nietzschean types or like pagan, like neo-pagan types, more than they are traditionalist Catholics or Orthodox. But I do tend to think that of the ones who choose to be Christian, they would tend to be either Orthodox or traditionalist Catholics. I don't think many of them would opt for Protestantism for whatever reason. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why. Uh, I think among mainline Protestants, there's really not much going. I mean, they've mainline Protestantism is pretty much sold. It's sold out to the the principalities and powers of the day. So they're for the most part pretty useless. Um, and I don't know, like the Southern Baptists and the evangelicals and the you know uh, fundamentalists. That just doesn't seem like the road that the that the dissident right kind of person would find himself going down. Um, although that said, there like the whole popularity of flat Earth among some people, some dissidents, is weird to me, and that makes me think, that maybe they would be okay going the more fundamentalist route. Although fundamentalists, for most of my life, even the most fundamentalistic Christian type of people that I knew still believed that we were on Earth and the Earth was the third planet orbiting a sun in a solar system. They still believed in the Copernican conception of the universe. So this whole flat Earth thing coming out in the last 7 or 8 years is pretty weird, and I'm a little leery of it for that reason. Okay, let me end this here. Part 3 coming up in a second.